Dry Creek woke slowly that spring morning just as Sheriff Ray Dalton took his usual seat on the porch with a mug of hot Folgers and the Dry Creek Daily. It should have been just another Tuesday. The breeze carried the faint scent of blooming creosote, and the cacti lining the edge of the cul-de-sac sparkled under a rising sun. Birds chirped half-heartedly from the pecan tree near the edge of Ray's lawn, as if too comfortable to bother with a proper song. He folded the paper and leaned back in his chair, letting the steam from the coffee curl under his nose. A quiet morning, just the way he liked it. His thoughts wandered, as they often did on mornings like this. The HOA had sent him notices before, once over a fence that was 2 inches too tall, another time because his mailbox flag was supposedly too faded. He'd shrugged, smiled, and replaced the flag with a shinier one, more out of sarcasm than compliance. But something about today tugged at him. There was a pressure in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. A rustling sound caught his attention. He glanced at the edge of the yard, where 4 figures emerged like an awkward parade. They walked in a tight formation, wearing matching navy polos with an embroidered Dry Creek HOA logo. The polos weren't new. At least one had a stain that looked like it came from Chile. All 4 wore sunglasses, though the sun was barely up. Ray didn't move. He sipped his coffee, eyes following them as they walked up the driveway and stopped in a clump just before the porch steps. One of them, a short woman with cropped, overly dyed auburn hair, stood with her arms folded, radiating the kind of authority that comes only from self-appointment. Karen Thompson. "Mr. Dalton," she began, without preamble or greeting. Her voice had a rehearsed tone, like she'd practiced this in front of a mirror. "You are in violation of several HOA rules, and we are here to take appropriate action." Ray didn't answer. He simply lowered his coffee mug, set it carefully on the table, and waited. Karen pulled a laminated piece of paper from her clipboard and thrust it toward him. "As of this morning, your property has been cited for non-compliant paint color on the garage door, possession of an unregistered vehicle, and refusal to attend mandatory community meetings." Behind her, the trio nodded like backup singers. Bill, whose belly stretched the seams of his polo, looked uncomfortable in the early sun. Lily had a toy radio clipped to her belt and kept adjusting it as though it might spring to life. Sandy, clipboard in hand, clicked a pen like a courtroom stenographer waiting to pounce. Karen stepped forward. "Due to continued non-compliance," she said, pausing dramatically, "the HOA is exercising its right to enact civil custody procedures." Ray raised an eyebrow. "Civil custody?" "You're being detained," Karen announced, "until the violations are resolved." Still, Ray didn't move. "By who?" "By us," Karen said, as Bill pulled a pair of plastic handcuffs from his back pocket, the kind sold in toy aisles. Ray's gaze flicked to the cuffs, then to Bill's face, then back to Karen. He reached slowly for his coffee, took one last sip, and stood. "Give me a moment," he said calmly. "Let me grab something inside." Karen nodded stiffly, mistaking his courtesy for submission. Ray stepped inside, set the mug in the sink, and opened the drawer by the door. Inside sat a small leather case. He hadn't touched it in months. He flipped it open, glanced at the badge inside, then walked back out onto the porch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply held up the case and let it fall open. The badge glinted in the sun. County Sheriff. Retired, yes, but not imaginary. Karen's lips parted, but no sound came. Bill froze mid-step. Lily adjusted her toy radio again, as if it might become real in the face of that badge. Sandy's pen hovered in the air like it was unsure whether to drop or flee. "You're impersonating law enforcement," Ray said, voice flat but firm. "That's a felony. Also attempted unlawful detention. Also harassment." He let the words settle. Karen looked around, perhaps hoping for cameras, for backup, for anything. There was nothing, just the quiet breeze, the flutter of the dry creek daily, and the sound of her plan unraveling. Bill took a step back. Sandy lowered the clipboard. Lily tried to say something, but gave up midway. Karen stiffened. "This isn't over, Sheriff." Ray said nothing. He simply watched as they turned, half-marched, half-slinked down the driveway. Neighbors had begun to peek out, through blinds behind half-cracked doors. Once the street was quiet again, Ray turned, picked up his coffee, and sat down. The warmth had mostly faded, but he drank anyway. He unfolded the paper. His eyes lingered, just briefly, on the direction the HOA crew had retreated. "Guess I'll be needing more coffee this week." The next morning, Ray's garbage bins are gone, and someone left a plastic cone and an official HOA sign across his driveway. He stared at it in silence. The cone, bright orange and clean as if just peeled from its plastic wrap, sat dead center at the edge of the driveway. The sign, zip-tied to a flimsy wooden stake, flapped gently in the breeze. "Garage access revoked. HOA enforcement. Code 3B." At the bottom was the Dry Creek HOA logo, slightly smudged from what looked like an inkjet printer running low on toner. Ray stepped off his porch, Folgers in hand, and looked both ways. Across the street, two figures sat on folding chairs under a porch awning. Lily held a notepad, while Sandy clutched a coffee thermos with a label that said HOA Watch. They waved. Ray didn't. He crouched, examined the base of the stake. No official markings, no city permit number. Just a generic garden stake from the local hardware store. He pulled the cone to the side and laid the sign flat on the grass. It was absurd, but he knew exactly who had planted it. The spring breeze carried the faint scent of orange blossoms and something else. Self-importance. Ray stood, walked back to the porch, grabbed his phone from the side table, and took several photos from different angles. No need to speak yet. Just document. That was the key. Karen's words from the day before echoed in his mind. This isn't over. It wasn't, not by a long shot. He opened the truck, slid the sign and cone into the bed, and got behind the wheel. The moment the engine turned over, Sandy lifted her notepad, scribbling something furiously. Ray pulled out without looking their way. Ruby's Diner sat a few blocks from the edge of town, where the storefronts still had old neon signs and the booths hadn't changed color since the late 80s. Ray parked in front of the window, slid into his regular seat in the back corner, and nodded toward the counter. Ellie saw him and grinned. She was in her 40s, quick with a smile and quicker with coffee. "Your usual?" "You bet." She returned a minute later with a steaming mug and a slice of cherry pie. "Made fresh this morning. We used the tart cherries this time. Want a scoop of vanilla?" "Not yet," Ray said, pulling out a small notebook from his coat. "Need a clear head." Across the booth, Martha Green settled into the seat with the cautious grace of someone who spent a little too long with books and not enough with chairs. She was in her 70s with kind eyes and hands that folded napkins as she talked. "Heard you had a run-in," she said softly. Ray nodded. "They sent the cone brigade." "I saw." She sipped her tea. "Lily's out there again this morning with binoculars. I think she borrowed them from her nephew's scout kit." Ray chuckled. "Didn't realize I was the town attraction." "You're not. Karen is. Folks are starting to talk." Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a yellow folder. "I thought this might interest you." He opened it slowly. Inside were printed spreadsheets, some handwritten notes in the margins, and a few crumpled newsletters from past years. "She never held a re-election," Martha said quietly. "The HOA charter says there has to be one every year. Last one on record was 3 years ago." Ray flipped through, pausing on a page titled 2023 HOA Budget. One line item stood out. Infrastructure, $3,400. It had no accompanying breakdown or meeting note, just the amount and a vague label. "Where'd you get this?" "Back copies from my late husband's files. He was on the board for 2 terms. Kept everything." She glanced around. People trusted him. Not like now. Ray nodded slowly. He could see the pattern forming. What started as power tripping had grown into quiet control. Karen's smile in public, her sharp tone in letters, none of it was random. She'd been preparing for this kind of grip. Ellie returned with a refill. "Need anything else, hon?" Ray shook his head. "Just the check." Ellie looked amused. "You always say that, and you always sit here for another half hour." As she walked away, Ray slid the folder back into his coat and pulled out a legal pad. At the top he wrote, "Incident 1, impersonation." Then under it, "Incident 2, harassment/signage." He added a line for budget inconsistencies, documents from Martha. He was mid-note when Ellie returned, not with the check, but a folded envelope. "Guy dropped this off 10 minutes ago. Said it was for you. No name." Ray opened it slowly. Another HOA citation, this one for removal of official HOA directive and failure to comply with garage closure. The language was laughably formal. Martha read over his shoulder and shook her head. "She's overplaying her hand." Before Ray could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. "Unknown number," he answered cautiously. "Ray?" The voice was nervous, familiar. One of the neighbors. Tom, maybe. "Listen, you home? Number Y? There are 2 sheriff cruisers outside your place. Like, right now. I heard someone reported a man with a gun. They said it matched your truck." Ray sat still. For a beat, he didn't answer. Then he reached for his coat and stood. "I'll be home in 5. Ray pulls into his driveway as 2 county deputies speak with Karen, who looks genuinely concerned, if you don't know better. The sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the cul-de-sac, bathing Dry Creek in that golden wash that made even cracked sidewalks look like something out of a postcard. But Ray didn't notice the light. His focus was on the 2 cruisers parked awkwardly across his lawn, tires nudging the edge of his flower bed. And Karen, of course, standing near her mailbox, one hand on her hip, the other gesturing broadly as she spoke to the deputies. He eased the truck to a stop, shifted into park, and stepped out with deliberate calm. The afternoon breeze carried a faint whiff of cut grass, courtesy of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. The whole scene might have passed as mundane, if not for the tension thick enough to chew on. Deputy Wilson turned first. He was in his 30s now, clean-shaven and solidly built. But Ray remembered when he was still fumbling through radio codes and asking how to hold a flashlight without blinding himself. The other deputy, Park, was newer. Quiet. Observant. The kind Ray would have kept an eye on just in case he turned out smarter than he let on. "Afternoon, Ray," Wilson said, voice careful. "Afternoon," Ray replied, not looking at Karen. "I hear you boys had a call?" Wilson shifted, cleared his throat. "We received a tip about a man matching your description, possibly armed. Said you were acting erratically in the neighborhood." Ray blinked slowly. "Is that right?" Karen stepped forward then, face all sympathy and strained worry. "Some neighbors were frightened, Ray. There was talk. You've been very tense lately, and the sign removal?" "Karen," Ray said evenly. "Stop." Wilson raised a hand, diffusing. "Look, we're not here to escalate. Just need to ask a few questions. Follow protocol." Ray reached into his back pocket and pulled out his leather badge case. He held it up, opened it slowly. The gold glint caught Park's eye first. He stepped back just slightly, hands relaxing. "I'm retired, not erased," Ray said. "I know the protocol. You're following it just fine." Park nodded. Wilson offered a half shrug as if to say, "I figured. We've got no reason to believe there's anything going on here. Just need to mark it down as a false report. You know the drill." Ray folded the badge back into his pocket. "I do." Karen tried again. "But Ray, don't you think it's a little unfair to dismiss the concerns of your neighbors? People are nervous. You've been avoiding meetings, rejecting rules, dismantling HOA-approved signage." Ray turned to her calmly. "You're playing theater, badly. This isn't about concern. It's about control." Park looked from one to the other, but said nothing. Wilson took a breath, clearly wanting to wrap things up. "Miss Thompson," he said, "you understand that making a false police report is serious?" Karen's eyes widened, her voice pitched up. "I never made a report. I just passed along what I heard. That's not the same thing." Wilson nodded, but there was no warmth in it. "Right. Just keep in mind, if this sort of call happens again without substance, it creates a paper trail." Karen said nothing. Her lips pressed together so tightly the corners turned white. Ray looked at Wilson. "We good?" "Yeah. Sorry for the trouble." He gave Ray a subtle nod that wasn't in any training manual. The cruisers backed out carefully, tires crunching the gravel with exaggerated slowness. As they disappeared down the street, the quiet returned. Karen stood frozen in place for another moment, then spun on her heel and stalked back toward her front door. Ray didn't watch her go. He turned and walked inside, shutting the door with just enough force to be heard, but not mistaken for anger. Inside, the air was cool. The late light filtered through the blinds and painted soft stripes across the floor. Ray moved to the kitchen table, pulled out the folder where he'd begun collecting documentation. He opened a new page. Incident 3, False Police Report. He dated it, logged the time, noted the deputies' names. From the side drawer, he grabbed a small stapler and affixed a printout of the HOA citation he'd received that morning. Then he picked up his phone, opened the voice memo app, and recorded a brief note. Clear, factual, no color. When he was done, he poured a fresh cup of coffee, though the hour was late for it. The act felt necessary, deliberate. He stepped back onto the porch, sat down, and let the warmth of the mug seep into his hands. The pecan tree rustled overhead, and in the house across the street, a curtain twitched, Martha, no doubt, taking silent notes of her own. If shish. Ray returns from the hardware store to find his front yard cordoned off with cones, a backhoe idling, and a crew preparing to dig. The smell hit him first, diesel fumes and freshly turned dirt. His boots crunched against gravel as he stepped out of the truck, eyes narrowing on the makeshift worksite. A line of cones zigzagged along the edge of his lawn, and a laminated sign zip-tied to a sawhorse read, in bold font, "Emergency plumbing work, authorized by Dry Creek HOA." The machine operator cut the engine as Ray approached, tipping his hat slightly, more out of habit than greeting. Behind him, a man in a neon vest fumbled with a clipboard. The foreman, probably. Ray scanned the scene. No markings on the lawn, no utility flags, no visible issue. Just a crew, a machine, and a lot of audacity. "Morning," he said, voice even. The foreman turned. "Sir, we're here to dig up a suspected leak near your main line. Got the order yesterday. Shouldn't take more than a few hours." Ray tilted his head. "May I see that order?" The man hesitated, then flipped to the top page of his clipboard. Ray took it without asking. The paper looked official enough until you noticed the signature line. Typed in bold italics. K. Thompson, HOA President. No contact number, no county permit number, no municipal seal. Ray pulled out his phone and began snapping photos. The cones, the machine, the forged document. Then he opened his badge wallet and held it up to the foreman, who blinked and took a half step back. "Retired," Ray said calmly. "Still legally entitled to flag unlicensed excavation on private property. And this," he tapped the paper, "doesn't hold up." The foreman scratched his neck. "Look, I'm just doing what I was told." "I understand, and I'm telling you, there's no authorized work here. You keep digging. That's trespassing." From across the street, Karen stood smugly under the shade of her porch awning, arms crossed like a victorious general surveying her battlefield. Ray didn't look at her. A door creaked open nearby, and Martha appeared, walking with her usual purposeful pace and a folder tucked under her arm. She handed it to Ray without a word. Inside was the HOA's budget from the last meeting. Highlighted in yellow was a line that read, "Emergency Infrastructure, $3,500. There were no meeting notes, no signatures, no approval records. "I checked with 2 board members," Martha said. "They never voted on it. Karen pushed it through unilaterally." Ray turned back to the foreman. "You understand now?" The man nodded, already waving to his crew. "Let's wrap it up, boys." One by one, the workers began retracting the equipment, muttering about wasted gas and time. The backhoe's engine sputtered back to life, reversing slowly down the street. Karen finally stepped off her porch and marched over, heels striking pavement like a gavel. Her face flushed with indignation. "You're sabotaging community improvements," she hissed. "That pipe could have ruptured and flooded your entire yard." Ray didn't flinch. "Not sabotaging, just documenting." She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already turning away. Inside the house, Ray laid the forged work order beside the HOA budget and began assembling a new folder. The stack grew, photographs of the lawn, the cones, Karen on her porch. He added it to the previous files, Incident 1 through 3, then labeled this new packet, Incident 4, Forged HOA Work Order. He called the county code enforcement line, requested a formal investigation, and submitted all materials digitally while Martha sat quietly in the kitchen, watching him work. "They'll send someone within 72 hours, he said after hanging up. "Maybe sooner." Martha nodded. "It's getting worse." "I know." The front door rattled with the sound of mail being pushed through. Ray crossed the room and picked up a thick cream-colored envelope with the Dry Creek HOA seal embossed in red. He slid it open with a key and pulled out the contents. Inside was a folded letter, formal, overly wordy, and typed in a font too elegant for what it said. Notice of disciplinary hearing. Revocation of residency due to community harm. The folding chairs are lined up, neighbors shuffle in with mixed looks. Karen stands like royalty at the front table. The room hums with tension, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glare across the Dry Creek Community Hall. The folding chairs creaked under shifting weight as residents found their seats. Some reluctantly, others eagerly, a few with arms crossed and expressions unreadable. At the front, Karen stood behind a long plastic table, draped with a navy blue cloth, and an oversized HOA banner taped to its edge. She wore a blazer too stiff for the Arizona heat, her blonde hair pinned back with more hairspray than mercy. A laptop glowed in front of her, connected to a projector that cast its light across a blank pull-down screen. Her smile was tight, manufactured. On the snack table nearby, someone had placed a plate of pie slices from Ruby's Diner, untouched. The smell of reheated coffee lingered in the corners of the room. Ray entered with slow steps, wearing a clean button-down and holding a plain manila folder. Martha trailed behind him, quietly taking a seat in the second row. She didn't speak, but her presence alone carried weight. A few people nodded to her. One man offered a polite smile to Ray, but quickly looked away when Karen's eyes swept the room. Karen clapped her hands together once, as if starting a game show. "Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming on short notice. Tonight's meeting is, unfortunately, about a matter of serious disruption to our community." Ray sat without a word, his folder resting on his lap. His eyes scanned the crowd, 20 or so neighbors, most of whom he recognized by lawn, if not by name. Some were clearly aligned with Karen, nodding dutifully as she spoke. Others looked uncomfortable, glancing between Ray and her, as if unsure which side of history they were seated on. Karen clicked a remote. A slideshow began. A grainy image of Ray's garage with a digitally added red tint, a photo of his mailbox with a bold arrow pointing at the post, a cropped picture of Ray standing next to the orange cone, taken from an odd angle, clearly intended to look confrontational. "These images," Karen said, "show repeated violations of HOA guidelines, unauthorized modifications, aggressive behavior toward enforcement officers, and refusal to comply with community protocols." Someone in the back shifted in their chair. Another coughed. Karen continued, her tone increasingly performative. "As president, it is my duty to ensure safety and order. That's why I've called this disciplinary hearing, to address not only Mr. Dalton's conduct, but also the broader danger of undermining community cohesion." Ray stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bring fanfare. He simply asked, "When was the last HOA election?" The question hovered in the air. Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" "The last election," Ray repeated. "The charter says annual elections are mandatory. When was the last?" There was a rustle through the chairs. Someone near the front began flipping through their folder. A man whispered to his wife. Karen floundered. "That's not relevant to—" "It's very relevant," Ray said, holding up his folder. "Because if you were never re-elected, every directive you've given since is illegitimate." He stepped forward and opened the folder on the table beside her laptop. "I have copies of unauthorized expenditures," he said. "Construction permits forged with your signature, budget entries with no meeting record. And here," he pulled out a still image from a security camera, "is footage showing your team placing false signage on my property." Karen reached to close the folder, but Ray held it firmly open. From the second row, Martha stood and began handing out matching copies to anyone who reached for one. A few people hesitated, then accepted them. The tide began to shift, not with a roar, but with murmurs, uncertain, yet growing. At the back of the room, a tall man stood up. He wore a county badge and held a clipboard under one arm. Mr. Lynn, the auditor Ray had alerted days earlier. "I'd like to say something," he said calmly. All eyes turned. "I'm with the county auditor's office," he continued, "and after reviewing these documents, I can confirm that several budget entries are inconsistent with HOA reporting standards. Effective immediately, we are opening an official investigation into HOA operations and financial practices." Karen stepped back, visibly rattled. Her voice wavered. "This is a setup." One neighbor near the front spoke up, voice louder than he meant. "You've been stealing from all of us." Another followed. "You used our dues to harass someone." Karen looked around. The loyal faces were gone. Even Lily and Bill had sunk lower in their seats. Ray stepped back, letting the silence speak. Karen tried to collect her papers with shaking hands. "This meeting is adjourned." She turned, moving quickly toward the exit, but before she could reach the door, Mr. Lynn intercepted her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firm but polite, "I'll need a word with you." Now. 1 week later, the for sale sign goes up in front of Karen's house. The street is silent, but lighter. Ray sat on his porch with a tall glass of iced lemonade, condensation slipping down the side and soaking into the napkin he'd wrapped around it. The pecan tree offered its usual patch of shade, and a soft breeze rustled the branches, just enough to keep the air from feeling still. From down the block came the quiet sounds of children laughing and the rhythmic creak of someone pushing a swing. Somewhere in the distance, the buzz of a paint roller echoed. The new HOA volunteers were repainting the tool shed behind the community sign. He watched the last moving truck pull away from Karen's house, the rear doors flapping slightly with each bump. The house looked suddenly ordinary again. No watchful eyes at the window, no laminated warnings taped to mailboxes. Just a tidy lawn and a white sign with red lettering, "For sale. Contact Rita Caldwell, Realty." Martha settled into the chair beside him, setting her own glass on the armrest. "You're looking better," she said. "Feels quieter," Ray replied, eyes still on the empty porch across the street. "Funny how much noise one person can make," she murmured, "or how much space they take up, even without saying much." Ray nodded, then reached into the small wooden box next to his chair. From it, he pulled a plaque wrapped in brown paper. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a mounted silver badge, his old sheriff's star, polished and set behind glass. A brass plate at the bottom read, "With honor, Sheriff Raymond Dalton, Dry Creek County." "There was a letter," he said almost to himself. "From the office. Said it was overdue." Martha smiled, watching him rise and walk over to the wall beside the front door. With a small nail and 2 taps of a hammer, he mounted the plaque just above eye level. He stepped back, looked at it a moment, then returned to his seat. "You finally retiring from being retired?" she teased. Ray chuckled. "I think I'm retiring from proving anything to anybody." A car rolled by slowly. The driver waved. Ray lifted his fingers in reply. Across the street, Gloria Smith stood by the new HOA bulletin board with a clipboard in hand. Early 60s, cardigan over a sundress, calm and methodical. She glanced over, smiled warmly, and gave a thumbs up. "She says she wants you as a community advisor," Martha said. "Not a title, just someone people trust." "I already gave her my answer." "And?" "I told her I'd come to meetings," Ray said. "But only if there's pie." Martha laughed. "Ellie already dropped one off, said it's a peace offering from the diner." "Good woman," Ray said. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. The sun dipped lower, casting long amber shadows across the sidewalk. A neighbor strolled by, walking a golden retriever. Another trimmed hedges quietly, nodding to the beat of music only they could hear. There was a rhythm returning to the block, a natural one, not dictated by fines and forms. From down the sidewalk came the sound of sneakers on pavement. A boy, maybe 10, wandered up with a baseball cap crooked on his head. He slowed as he neared the porch, eyes flicking from the mounted badge to Ray. "Were you really a sheriff?" the boy asked. Ray sipped his lemonade, then nodded with a faint smile. "Once, but now I just make good coffee." One man's quiet resolve was all it took to tip the balance in a neighborhood teetering between order and control. Ray didn't fight with fists or fury. He fought with patience, principle, and a file folder full of truth. In the end, justice wasn't loud. It simply stood its ground until the noise faded. Like a well-tended porch at sunset, peace returns when we protect what matters and let dignity do the talking. Sometimes the strongest fences aren't made of wood, but of wisdom and a little good coffee.